What we'll do is cover a number of themes to do with cannabis, a better understanding of cannabis, the challenges of knowledge translation regarding cannabis, and I'll probably start off with 4 key points, which will probably summarize the whole presentation. 1, it's impossible to be an expert on cannabis. It's just impossible. There's so much we don't know, and what we are doing is scratching the surface with the little knowledge we have. That's point 1. Point 2, there's no single cannabis, and it's impossible to generalize what cannabis is. Point 3, it's very, very complex. And point 4, it depends. So with those points, I can pretty much head back to Kingston, presentation done. But what I'll try and do is fill in those gaps with more information. And a very brief story about my journey here. So I was meant to be heading down by rail. The tracks have been blocked around Belleville. So, okay, option 2, by air. Booked a flight, Air Canada, 45 minutes, Kingston to Toronto. Got to the airport, the flight was cancelled. Option 3, road. So the airline made an emergency arrangements to have me come down by road. I didn't tell the driver what I did, but he proceeded, as we passed a particular part of the 401, to tell me about how he found a particular type of cannabis product helpful. And the only problem he had with it once in a while was feeling a bit drowsy or giddy. That journey was by the seat of my pants. Right. So my affiliations, Kingston Health Sciences Centre, Providence Care Hospital, Queen's University, declarations of interest. To the best of my knowledge, I do not have any cannabinoids in my bloodstream at the moment. I don't have investments in the cannabis industry, and the content of this material is solely mine, and I take absolutely full responsibility for whatever I say or present. The objectives, again, going over, there's no single cannabis. It's extremely heterogeneous. We'll talk about the challenges of knowledge push and knowledge pull, and whose knowledge it is or not, and we'll touch on some motivational approaches. So cannabis, weed, marijuana, ganja, whatever name we need to use or choose to use, has been applied in many settings and has been part of folklore and culture for millennia. Over and over it gets magazine headlines and covers, ranging from business to gender issues to, I won't talk the politics one on the right side of the screen there. But you know, a whole range of issues, and it remains topical over and over and over. And yet we find ourselves in the late 2000s in a completely different surge of knowledge and understanding. Once upon a time, 1936, there was the film Reefer Madness. I don't think anyone in the room would have been there on the day it was launched. But if you look at the bottom corner, does this have a pointer? Youthful marijuana victims. Women cry for it, men die for it. And this was meant to be a sort of scare tactic, youth engagement approach to cannabis awareness, which failed. Drug crazed, abandoned. Now, cannabis and cannabis products have been around for a long, long, long time, way, way back, as I said, millennia. But in a sort of more recent history, there were medical cannabis products sold by big companies. One of the companies with a bottle there actually makes an antipsychotic and also makes an antidepressant. And it was available. In fact, at that time, any self-respecting physician would have cannabis products, cocaine, and opioids in their doctor's bag. Now, if you're a self-respecting physician and you walk down the streets of Toronto with cannabis products, cocaine, and opioids in your doctor's bag, you probably won't be a physician for much longer. So Canada took the plunge, and the legalization of cannabis for recreational use and medicinal use has been a big, big, big affair. In fact, Canada leads the world in this dynamic space due to some policy, legalization, and other areas. And what's happened is there was a thriving grey market. You may choose your color, whether you choose for it to be grey or black market. With recreational cannabis there and medical. And what the government's trying to do is to reduce the availability of cannabis products through the grey or black market through legislation and policy for recreational use and for medical purposes. I'll be mixing up the words medical purposes and medical, so not all cannabis consumption for medical purposes is from a medically approved source. So where do people get their cannabis from? And this is from the Canadian National Cannabis Survey. Well, some people, the one on the orange shows the more recent, that's 2019. So there appears to be a shift of cannabis from, in quotes, illegal sources to more legal sources. And friends and family will always be around. The weed man isn't going to retire, and we've got to recognize that these people are part of our social culture and existence. So how do we engage these sort of transitions gradually over time without all being criminalization? We heard some important points, and there'll probably be discussion during the break. So once upon a time, it was the picture on the left, and there's a whole cost. You know, how much does it cost? In some centers now, whatever I say by reference, by the way, is not marketing. It's all for educational purposes. But there are places now where you can get weed of the day, value weed, mystery weed. And weed of the day is just stock management. It could be anything from 20% THC, 5% THC. Value weed, you know, $5 per gram. You don't know what are you getting, but my oh my, you're getting your $5 worth. Mystery weed, you know, is like a lucky dip. You put your hand in, you pick up, and get whatever you get. So these are very dynamic, and the alternative market is also challenging some of the prices. So, well, as you see, the Postie now delivers as well, and you can order online. So it's a huge industry, multi-billion-dollar industry. Whatever we present with the numbers, as it gets presented, is old, because you know the industry is growing, is shrinking, market forces are testing the industry as well, chief execs are moving, stuff is on the stock exchange, up, down, and it's yet to settle, which makes sense because these are first mover issues. Motivation to consume, and this was something study done by Deloitte. A lot of people use cannabis to relax and sleep. Others to reduce stress and anxiety, to have fun with friends, to improve their mood. So if we look at those top ones, a lot of people actually try to use cannabis products for their emotional and mental well-being. And we can't ignore that. So if we work with mental health or people's emotions and well-being, we're probably going to find ourselves in cannabis space whether we like it or not. As I said earlier, there's no single cannabis. And if anyone's grown or seen plants, even the leaves are different. Some may have 9 tips, some may have 7 tips, some may have 5 tips. Some leaves, parts of the leaves are fatter, some are skinnier, and so on. So there's no single cannabis. And we use the term, and I'll say this several times through the presentation, the term cannabis is as useful as saying dog. What breed? Is it a Chihuahua or is it a Great Dane? Because if I've got a security job and I've been turned up, okay, Deji, you're going to be head of security for York University, you'll be on patrol, so make sure you bring your dog with you. And I turn up with my Chihuahua in a basket. It's a different narrative. So there's no single cannabis. So what does cannabis look like? Well, there's the common image of the joints, but not too far away from here, there was a cannabis drive-through. And you may think, oh, well, maybe it's not really a drive-through and so on. But hey, you can buy your gas, get your weed, and hit the road. Last time I checked, I think they've closed, but as of this time, you know, you could get your cannabis, sit there al fresco, order like a drive-through burger or anything else, and hit the road. But what does cannabis look like? Ah, some of you say, yep, the rolled up joint, I know this. But is this the only face of cannabis? And this is a challenge because when we stereotype the image of cannabis, oftentimes we can consume considerable amounts of cannabis products and the active components without ever smoking. So when you hear about school kids consuming things, what may they have consumed? Now, again, none of this is for marketing, but this is cannabis, a product branded. Some of the following slides are products more available in the US than Canada, but again, it's all part of knowledge space. And this is more for amorous activity, you know, for love. You spray it, and there's a whole industry of cannasex. This, again, is not Canada, but these are infused products where you've got, some of those are 100 milligrams of THC. Now, 100 milligrams of THC, depending on what sort of potency of joint you're smoking, is worth several joints. But I only had apple cider or an apple drink. These, again, these will never be licensed in Canada because they're too potent. But you've got the one, you know, you've got the Irish cream one, 180 milligrams of THC, and each chocolatelet, if there's any such word, is 45 milligrams of THC. But it's really different to the other chocolate, which is 60-60 and so on. So really, can we generalize? These aren't, these wouldn't be licensed in Canada because they've got too much THC per unit, and Canada's standard is 10 milligrams, which we'll touch on. Or mint. And that guy in your office who never shares his mint, so stingy, he might just be saving you from occupational health. Or high-end products with infused, again. So these are some of the other faces of cannabis. And so when we think of smoke-filled rooms and joints, that's not what all cannabis is about, or cannabis products. I mean, this, I think ethically, if you work in youth world, this again will never be licensed in Canada, but you've got 200 milligrams of THC in a colorful drink with a colorful bottle called quencher. I mean, what do you quench is thirst? So this pretty much inviting you to swig quickly and get stoned. Do we know what this is? Shatter, yes. So shatter by name, shatter by nature, and we'll talk a bit more about it. It's a cannabis product which is highly concentrated and can have up to 90%, 80-90% THC. So we're not comparing like with like, and certainly you can't consume this in large quantities. It's quite often dabbed. Now we're getting to the stuff available through the Ontario cannabis store. So the next few slides will show you what you can actually buy online within this province. Cookies. Who doesn't like chocolate? And a whole soft gels and so on. So these are actually prepared with different color coding to indicate different dosing. But these are things that are also consumed and contain cannabis, THC, CBD, different ratios, which we'll talk about more. So again, the concept of cannabis being all smoke is wrong. And some of these products actually could be considerably more than smoking in potency. These mints as well. And okay, they're designed not to look like sweets and so on, but they do contain cannabis products. Because I might have a penchant for chocolate. I've shown more than one chocolate slide. But again, the point being, cannabis can present really attractively, and we shouldn't assume all cannabis is the same. Different gummies and so on. And these are available within this province legally. Tea. Vaping, which we'll touch on as well. And again, emphasizing difference. Even the flowery buds, the dried flowers, are different. And these are sprays, and there are also oils and other paraphernalia. So cannabis and youth health, what's the big deal? I mean, why pick on youth? Surely other people use cannabis or weed or marijuana. Why youth? What's the big deal or concern about youth? Well, the stats speak for themselves. So this is the National Cannabis Survey. If we look at the third quarter 2019, look at cannabis use in the past 3 months by age. 15 to 24, 25 to 34, young people, male more than female. Again, if we look at other studies done, and this was extracted from that, if you look at the top curve, the orange line on top, it's not very clear, but again, both male and female, the largest consumers are youth. 18 to 24 is the top orange line. Again, Canadian Cannabis Survey, if you look again, youth. I mean, older populations above 65 is actually the largest growing group, and there's been a 27% increase in the last 10 to 14 years amongst over 65s, but that's not the presentation of the day. So the older group are also working hard at it for different purposes, but youth are on the whole the largest consumers. They use more frequently in larger quantities. And why does this matter? Well, it matters because, one, the consumption is large, it's heavy, it's frequent, and they are a uniquely vulnerable group, which we'll explain more. These are Ontario schools. So this was a survey done. CAMH does amazing work, and this is the drug use among Ontario students. And look at that curve. So grade 7, about 2% cannabis use, and by grade 12, nearly 40%. And look at the acceleration, and it begs the question, when, at what age should we start learning about cannabis? Don't forget to put up your stickers, by the way. What age should we learn? I mean, look at the acceleration. And we can't ignore the fact that as young people are getting older, into their teens, early teens, cannabis consumption is going up. Does this matter? Well, yes, it does. If we look at work done by the Canadian Institute for Health Information, published 2019, 1 in 20 hospital stays among youth in Canada were related to harmful substance use. Okay, but that doesn't mean it's cannabis. 17% of youth hospitalized had a link with substance use and readmissions. 7 in 10 hospital stays for harm caused by substance use involved a concurrent mental disorder. Right, so we're now getting to the world of mental health and youth. And 40% of the most of the substances associated with hospital admissions were to do with cannabis. So really, cannabis and youth and hospital care do overlap. And this is really important even from a policy point of view, because for those of you who are health economists, this converts to bed days and the cost and so on. Alcohol also plays a role. If we look at the green column, that's cannabis. You've got cocaine, alcohol, and the rest, opioids. But cannabis stands head and shoulders above the others. Looking at age, again, 15 to 17, 18 to 24. But again, the point I'm trying to make here is for all of you that work with youth in different organizations, your jobs are very relevant. You know, you cast aside youth work at your own peril. And I'll reinforce that with a few more slides. So again, males more than females, but on the whole, cannabis consumption is a big issue amongst youth hospitalization. And it has an effect on mental health. Now, the red one there is to do with schizophrenia, so you've got mood disorders, anxiety disorders, and so on, but there's a red row. Now, you may say that's not really that much. If this was spread for the next 5 years for this population, it'll begin to count. It just happens to be schizophrenia's onset is late teens, early 20s into mid 20s further down. So if this was stretched a few more years, that red row would actually get considerably longer. This was very interesting for me to notice. There are youth in rural populations and remote with very, very complex health needs that we don't, for those of us in urban areas or semi-urban, don't really fully appreciate. So when it comes to actually age-standardized difficulties, urban versus rural and remote, the orange column are those in remote areas. And they're really going through a tough time. They're sort of forgotten in the kilometers and kilometers of Canadian acreage. A few slides from my service, so the Early Psychosis Programme, and this just gives an insight into what can happen in real world. So we're looking at young people who attend the Early Psychosis Programme from the age of 14 to 35, looking at cannabis-related issues for them. Over 80% self-reported cannabis use. Okay, you may say, oh, okay, it's youth just talking bravado and so on. But when we did urine toxicology, nearly 70% had positive urine toxicology. Now, urine toxicology measures at a particular level. So quite often it's measuring 50 nanograms. If you had it more sensitive at 20, you'd even pick up more. So a large number of them actually had cannabis in their bloodstream amongst this youth psychosis population. A proportion didn't finish school or had left education. And again, if we look at that curve, 20 to 24, the sort of youth population, younger people you work with. Compared to national, their peer-matched ages, colleagues, so the yellow was 2013, gray 2015, orange 2017. The blue line is the early psychosis population, and their cannabis percentage with cannabis-related difficulties considerably more than the general population. So is this new, or are we just picking on young people? After all, we've all been young before. Let's flash back into history. This was a study I did looking at asylum admissions into colonial British asylums for Indian hemp insanity, which was a diagnosis at the time. And looking at the number of the ages of people admitted to colonial asylums in the 1800s for Indian hemp insanity. It's exactly the same curve. 21 to 25, younger people, so teens and youth. So this is quite an issue. I can make this available on request. So cannabis is socially acceptable, in fact, way more socially acceptable than tobacco. And I know that from experience. I was traveling somewhere in Ontario. I was standing on a train platform, and a guy loaded a pipe with cannabis. I said, wow, okay, this is interesting. And next thing I saw him roll an amazingly large joint. And he walked up to me and said, this is for you. I said, hey dude, I don't smoke, but thanks. But it's socially acceptable. Now, if you brought out a cigarette or a joint, people are probably going to frown more on the cigarette than the joint. And that reflects also the social changes in society. Perceived risk of harm, people feel, oh, you smoke a cigarette, oh goodness, you'll die of lung cancer, don't smoke, oh, be careful. But people are way more open to using cannabis and consuming edibles. Males more than females. And Canadian Cannabis Survey, again, frequency of cannabis used, people are consuming quite a lot per day. Some people 6 or more joints. I use the word joint hypocritically because I'm going to rip apart the concept of a joint. It means nothing. And a lot of people use it for medical purposes, in fact, consuming more for medical purposes than they do recreationally. Isn't this amazing? Each clock is an hour. There are people who are stoned 8, 9 hours a day. This is subjective reporting. And if we are a bit more scientific about it, it gets a level where you're aware you're stoned. So these people could have been stoned pre or post. And I've estimated this with some young people I work with, and they're actually not present for 12 hours a day. So there are people who are also quite impaired for many hours a day. Methods of consumption, these trends change. They'll keep changing with the legalization of cannabis edible products. These trends will continue to change, but smoking is attractive. Edibles are going up. Vaping was going up. Now is it going down? We'll look at vaping. We don't know the way it's trending now, and vaporizers and so on. So different methods have different allure. Young people, again, heavy consumers. And it's reported that Canadian youth are the heaviest cannabis consumers in the documented Western world. It's not my stats, but it's been replicated many, many times over. The impact on education, well, about 12% report using weekly or either before or during school. 34% of frequent heavy users are current students, and age at initiation does vary and depend on the study, but the ages range from starting around 14 through to 18 in different populations. This is very simplistic, but the suggestion is the bigger the weed, the less the book, and the more the book, the less the weed. It's not cause and effect, but it makes sense. And there'll always be an award-winning PhD academic who's used cannabis all their life, who cleared out the class. So again, it's very difficult to generalize. For those who like Charlie Brown. Great. So cannabis use happens in campuses, and when you've got a magazine dedicating to ranking Canadian universities by marijuana use, then there's an issue. And there's a lot of cannabis use on campuses, and it's changing some of the campus culture in different campuses around the country. Why are we so obsessed with younger people? And again, hats off to all of you who work with youth. About 75% of mental disorders have their genesis or base in early years, before the age of 24. So every intervention each of you does with a young person, you're probably considerably carrying out an intervention regarding severe or complex mental health needs as these people become get older into their life trajectories as adults, spouses, workers, partners, and so on. So your work does count. Does this matter again? Yes, this was an interesting study looking at cannabis exposure and the impact on the trajectory of health issues. And what was identified by these researchers was the green cannabis exposure bit, frequent recurrent cannabis use having an impact on the trajectory and increasing in some people who are vulnerable the risk of psychosis. Now, legislation's around the age of 18 to 21, but then it's said that the brain matures around the age of 25, give or take, but around the age of 25. So it means legislation is occurring when the brain isn't fully mature. And what does that mean? So I'm of legal age. I think, yeah, I've got 7 years to go. I can use heavily, but I can do myself considerable damage with cannabis use even then. Is anyone here who's never been an adolescent? Great. Was this what your brain was like? You know, I want an afro, no, I don't want an afro. I like, you know, this, I don't know. I like rap, I don't like rap. I'm in love, no, I'm not in love. And adolescence is just an odd period. I mean, it's pretty akin to, I wouldn't say like mental disorder, but it's a really complex period in the lives of all of us. And it's a period where the neurons in the brain proliferate. So the neurons are just there, the wiring is going on and on and on, and way more wiring than we need. A process known as synaptogenesis. And it's just wiring all over the place. Now, a way of looking at it is, if you think of each of our brains like a building with electricians walking in. So in adolescence, you've got the electricians there, and they're just plugging things in, you know, fuses are blowing, wires are short-circuiting, you've got a big, massive air conditioner on a tiny fuse and so on, and someone says, yeah, I think we should go to China tonight. Yeah, why don't we go to China tonight? And you're heading off at 2 a.m. and they're wondering, hold on, but I don't have any money. And that's adolescence. And for those of you working with adolescents, it takes great patience and skill to achieve these therapeutic relationships. Now, what then happens is, as the brain continues to mature, closer to around the age of 25, there's a whole process of pruning. And so the neurons, the excess, begin to cut down. And if we can think of the house with the electricians, think of the developing bits while the brain's developing. You've got the brain with, you guys remember the old internet analog signal, dial-up. So fuses blowing all over the place, and closer to around the age of 25, there's a whole process of pruning, tidying up all those old wires, blown fuses, and so on. As that's going on also, the wires are being changed from dial-up internet to fiber optic. and that's the process of myelination. And with that fiber optic, then there's learning, there's experience. You then realize, actually, although you fancy every single girl in class, you can't realistically have a relationship with every single girl in class and survive, and so on. So with that process then of myelination, the brain begins to mature. And roughly around the age of 25, the electricians then say, okay, Deji, job done. We're off, have a good life. But I'm just starting to use weed, but these fuses have blown, and the wires are there tripping. But where does this plug in? You're 25, brain's maturing. And that's the real emphasis around the age of 25, and the work you do, why it's just so critical, because you're developing a major platform for young people with developing brains into a critical stage of life. Does age matter? Yes, because younger people, psychosis has its onset around that period. These figures vary, but then ultimately frequent, heavy cannabis use from an early age around the 12 to 14 can bring forward psychosis. It can increase the risk. These figures vary, but the risk increases. We cannot talk about young people, adolescents, young adults without talking about sex. I mean, it'll be a wasteful opportunity to miss it out. There are sex differences in the effects of cannabis products between male and female. The receptor presence and density is different between males and females, and the propensity to either dependence, harmful use, and so on does have gender differences as well. Whether we acknowledge it or not, people use cannabis products for intimacy, and it's a dose-dependent effect. So yes, if some people say, I use a bit and I feel all loved up, there can be evidence of that, depending on what potency and so on. But also, you use way too much. You're paranoid. And that changes the whole picture. So in low doses, it can have some of the experiences people report to you is probably valid. But then this carries a high risk then of paranoid symptoms. Same thing with guys. Again, it increases the risk of paranoid symptoms when used in large, heavy quantities. So let's get into some science. Cannabinoids. So they're phytocannabinoids, which are plants, endocannabinoids. Every single one of us has an endocannabinoid system in us, then synthetic. And we'll talk the endocannabinoids first. Somehow, human beings have found a substance that unlocks something in their body. I mean, think of it. Who goes around looking for coffee plants, looking for the coffee seeds and so on, roasts them, puts that in hot water, and says, yeah, that makes me alert? I mean, who goes around the coca plant, extracting stuff, turning it into powder, and getting high? Who goes around doing that with tobacco? Yeah, let's burn these leaves and see how we feel. The opioid, the poppy plant, will slice the tops of the flowers, take the milk, dry it, and whoa, we've got opioids and heroin and opium. So human beings have done this over and over and over again, and somehow there's some plant material that unlocks a system in our bodies. People have probably tried smoking tomato seeds and no effect. But people have tried a lot. So endocannabinoid system we all have in us. And the two better understood ones are the CB1 receptors, which are around the brain, the central nervous system, and so on, and CB2, which is around the immune system. So CB1 and CB2. And we'll talk about THC and CBD because they work on these two systems in different ways. You're joking if you think I'm going to be talking about this now. But what we are saying is, with the endocannabinoid system, it's a really complex interaction, even within the synapses. And for those of you around in the afternoon session, we'll have a fun game exercise that explains this better. It'll be an activity involving dope balls. So phytocannabinoids, plant cannabinoids. These are plant cannabinoids, and if you look at these, you've got these vesicles. They're called trichomes. It's the female plant. Rest assured, when it comes to cannabis and the cannabis plant, as we're referring to, we're really talking about the female plant. So man smart, woman smarter when it comes to cannabis. The male plant is pretty much hemp. It's good for bags and, you know, roughage and so on. It's the female plants, the flowery top of the female plants that contain these vesicles called trichomes, and within these vesicles are where there's a density of THC, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. Okay, what are all this taxonomy? You know, I prefer a sativa. No, I'm into my indicas, and one gives me a body feel, one gives me a head rush, one gives me a body sensation, and so on. Hybrids. The reality is there's been so much hybridization, growing, that a lot of the cannabis out there are now no longer thoroughbreds. They're mongrels. They're being crossbred. And it could look like a sativa and hit like an indica, and vice versa. And there was a study carried out, a study looking at the genetic, you know, so geneticists looked at cannabis products to try and identify. Now, these were all meant to be sativas, and everyone talked about them as sativas. But when they did the genetics, the true sativas were the red dots. And these plants just had legacies from all over the place. Some were hybrids, some were primarily indicas, but everyone labeled them as sativas. So oftentimes, when we make those references, they're no longer as valid as they used to be. I mean, you'll get thoroughbreds in villages in Africa, parts of rural Asia, and so on, but no longer as much now. Difference. Even the seeds are different. So again, there's no single cannabis. The buds are different. There's no single cannabis. This was on a platform. It's been modified now, but again, they were trying to show differences as well. So the phytocannabinoids, there are over 100, and there's still more being discovered. The two that we know better about are delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, which was discovered in 1964. There's another THC that was discovered in 1964 that's a beverage. But I won't mention, I don't want to get sued. There's a coffee chain. Now, the potency has increased, and what's happened is the desire to have more potent cannabis products has led to people growing and growing, and people are growing more THC in, and with a view to getting, well, something that can give a better or bigger high. THC. So THC acts more on the CB1 receptor. It's got a range of effects in optimum doses for a number of medical conditions. This has been explored further. None of these are medical recommendations I'm making, but just showing where some of the science is going. And a warning, when people say they use cannabis products for vomiting, the evidence is actually chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. Not hyperemesis, not vomiting in pregnancy. The evidence is actually for cancer related from chemotherapy. CBD, which gives more of a relaxed effect. Again, that acts more on the CB2 receptor, and now the evidence is sufficient for an anti-seizure medication. So there's a medication licensed by the FDA, Epidiolex, which is actually used for the treatment of complex seizure disorders from the age of 2. And it's licensed. We see all sorts of memes. So there's a cat, the cat eats a cannabis leaf and goes, wah, and so on, and wow. That's not really real. Because really, a lot of the cannabis, when it's a fresh bud plant material, is dormant. It's in the acid form, and it is not really active. I could probably chew a number of buds and not get high. Because there's a whole process called decarboxylation, a process of heating that then converts the acid form to the active component. So the acid form of CBD and THC, through heat, then decarboxylation becomes active. Note this because I'm going to make a point about labeling. And for those who bought licensed products, you may notice on the labels, THC and THC, total THC. Total THC is the THC at rest. It's not being cooked. It's your car idling in the car park. Total THC is when it hits the road. So here's an example of packaging, and so THC there says 3.45 milligrams. Total THC, 81.5. So when you decarboxylate it and heat it, this is what you'll get out of the product. And it's really important to note, because sometimes people buy and say, what I bought was just 3.45 milligrams THC, but I was so stoned. I said, did you look at the packaging? That's it, closer up. And that's why even vape devices and so on have different temperatures, because at different temperatures you will evoke different levels of THC. And if you overheat, you can burn it into zero. So these devices, again, not marketing, this is for something for infusing. They involve setting temperatures to decarboxylate and to get an optimum dose out of it. Terpenes, and we'll have a bit more exercise on it, but now we're even talking terpenes and terpenoids, and these are sort of aromatic compounds. And cannabis is getting so much love that other plants haven't received, because other plants have terpenes. Myrcene is found in mangoes, pinene in pine, limonene in lemon, and cannabis products actually have unique terpenes that smell the aroma, that give them their characteristics. And that world is then going into the world very similar to buying perfumes. So I'd like the cannabis, 25% THC, but I have a preference for a citrusy smell, or I prefer something like that. And that's the way cannabis is going as well, with some of the understanding. And these terpenes have different properties as well. Anyone here heard of spice or K2? This is a completely different beast. Spice K2 is made in the lab, and unlike cannabis, and the endocannabinoids has an affinity for receptors that just sticks on. So the plant material consumed, it gets metabolized, breaks down to 60%, 40%, 20%, and then out. Spice, made in the labs in the UK, is called the zombie drug. Sticks on 100% affinity, and metabolized is still 100%, third time still 100%, and can cause very, very frothing, disturbing psychotic experiences. So if we now go quickly to cannabinoid ratios. Now, again, there's no single cannabis, and I'll make a point about the ratios now. So we're going to stick to 30% THC, which is moderately high. 30% THC with 10% CBD, so that's a ratio of 3 to 1. Now, if we think of THC, this is really crude and simplistic, like THC like the accelerator of the car, and think of CBD like the brakes. Okay, so like the accelerator and the brakes, or if you're really into dogs, the dog being THC, CBD the lead. So this is a ratio 3 to 1. 30% THC, 1% CBD, that's a ratio 30 to 1. 30% THC, 0.1% CBD, ratio 300 to 1, 3,000 to 1. And this is different because the first one is like a car, standard car with standard brakes. The other is the standard car with motorbike brakes. The other is standard car with bicycle brakes. And if you love Flintstones, the last one's like Flintstones, the standard car, you're sticking out your foot. So although it's 30% THC, the THC-CBD ratio changes what the product is. So we cannot ignore these ratios. And it requires roughly, really crudely, about 3 times as much CBD to start reining in the effect of THC. So the ratios do matter. These are just illustrations from another platform, but what people are doing is trying more and more to find ways of illustrating the differences in products. So cannabis metabolism, so smoking versus ingested, and you've got some amazing material in your packs as well. Now, it's really interesting because THC and cannabis products don't go like water as much. They actually love fat. THC loves fat. Even if the one thing you're going to remember today from Valentine's Day, as you may imbibe or not, is THC loves fat. So it's consumed, goes into the fat reserves of the body, and then gradually gets metabolized and is then gradually released. And that's why it's quite a different relationship between cannabis-used THC and alcohol. Alcohol, you clear 1 unit of alcohol in 1 hour. With cannabis, it's not the same. You've got, I'll use my own anatomy, you've got breast, belly, bum, all with fat in them, just, soaking away like a depot and then gradually releasing. And that's why frequent heavy cannabis use, a person can still test positive 6 weeks afterwards, after stopping, because you've still got stuff to release. And you may think, okay, I'm going to have a really good workout before the workplace testing. Good on you, mate. You're just releasing it from the fat reserves up for harvest. So it's complex because you've got pharmacodynamics, different cannabinoids interacting with our endocannabinoid systems. We all have an endocannabinoid system. Our endocannabinoid systems change with our age, our activities, stress levels. For women, the time of the month. It's not one static system. We've got the pharmacokinetics, whether we inhale it, eat it, put it rectally, transvaginally, skin and so on, and the various effects, and reminding ourselves that given there's only 2 cannabinoids we know well, there's the whole interaction of all of them. Now, if you think of something referred to as an entourage effect, which is one of the terms used, if we only know 2 cannabinoids reasonably well, we're in the land of hockey. So think of a game of hockey where you know 1 forward and 1 goaltender. The forward and the goaltender do not explain the whole game. And it's really naive to think because you know those 2, you know the whole game. If you're really more into classical music, so you've got a symphony, and there's 1 person playing maybe on the first violin and another person playing on a harp or something. Now the violin and the harp, those 2 do not explain the whole orchestra. So the 2 guys we know, THC and CBD, cannot fully explain what all the other cannabinoids are doing. It's just that we don't have the knowledge yet. What we do know is when we smoke cannabis, it gets the brain within a few minutes and can hang around for about 2 to 3 hours. While when we eat cannabis or edible consumption, it goes through the gut, is broken down, and the release is slower and can be around for 4 to 6 hours. Now this is quite significant because if I hit the 401 from Kingston, and before I get to the border of Kingston, my smoked is where I begin to hit. While the edible I've consumed, I'm cruising down. I'll pass Belleville, I'm fine. And it may be I'm just getting into Toronto and I wonder why the 401 has 16 lanes. And that's one of the challenges with edible consumption. The onset isn't as rapid. I've worked with young people who've described consuming edibles, being perfectly fine and waking up stoned. 8 hours later, it's then peaked and it's hitting. There are other examples, and the challenge is the latent period, because if I consume and I have an expectation the effects will be rapid, and look at those delicious chocolates we showed earlier, and goodness, I thought this had, hey mate, I thought you gave me weed. There ain't no weed in this. And you have it more and more and more, you can have these sort of effects, whereby there's an uncertain effect and a mild effect, moderate, full effect, intoxicant effect, and you're high. So edibles are very different, and that's part of why Canada wisely with legislation delayed the legislation for edible products 1 year afterwards. Ultimately, we do not have an etiquette for cannabis consumption. Now, if we look at alcohol, the size of the vessel roughly influences what we take. So the more potent the alcohol, the smaller the vessel. So spirits in shots, wine in wine glasses, champagne in flutes, and then the beer in the big mugs. You would not pour a big mug, well you could, of vodka, but at your own peril. And that's an etiquette that's evolved over years. We don't have that etiquette for cannabis yet. And for those of us working with youth and in families, even modeling the etiquette for cannabis consumption, it's still early days. And that's why Health Canada, apart from with legislation, has made sure that the edible products are available in 10 milligram units. So it's 10 milligrams, whatever you consume, 10 milligrams. And that helps us get a rough idea, okay, I'm a 20 milligram person. When I have 15 milligrams, I'm done. 2.5 is my number. So health effects. These were the previous warnings Health Canada had. They had lots of numbers and so on. And these labels have gone. So as of October 2019, these labels were changed. So the older products in the packaging, you'll see these sort of labels on them, but these have now changed. So these, so smoke from cannabis, and it's got these, how do you pronounce these? Polyaromatic hydrocarbons, aromatic amines, and 9 heterocyclics are found. So as I read this and I buy my cannabis, the warning really is smoking is never a healthy route for consuming anything. Several of these. Pregnancy. Cannabis products do go through breast milk to the baby, and that poses a risk considerably. And there are babies now being born with their urine testing positive for THC. Transplacental also, and some studies suggest up to 10% of what mom consumes goes to baby. This can be irritating to me. That's a bit of a... driving. Again, it can cause drowsiness, impairment, but again, not one single cannabis. Are we talking THC or CBD? Frequent prolonged use and the risk of dependence. And some people do get dependent on cannabis. And people think, oh, you can't get dependent. Yes, you can. Adolescents and young people being a greater risk of harm. And again, a group you work with. Higher the THC, and the higher the THC, there is increased risk, which we'll touch on. This we've touched on. I'll skip some of these slides that we've touched on. And really, when we talk of education, you need good attention and concentration for memory. So anything that impairs attention or impairs concentration will impair memory. We need attention and concentration for problem-solving skills. And these are some of the areas where cannabis can affect Johnny or Deji in the classroom. Mental health we'll talk about more in exercises, but on the whole, given that THC has a greater affinity for dopamine, and dopamine is the neurochemical most implicated in psychosis and schizophrenia, we can see that it's not far-fetched how these effects could really impair people. The evidence for worsening depression, bipolar, and suicidality also exists. But some of the greatest evidence is for psychosis. We wouldn't have the time now, but we can talk about this in greater detail. But psychosis, we're talking about being out of touch with reality, having odd experiences, which may include hallucinations, hearing a voice. All of the 5 senses one can hallucinate from. So, for instance, I'm just wondering why, did this kaleidoscope just say hi? And so on. So a person and then starts to feel paranoid and suspicious. And it makes sense because every experience we have when we're psychotic, because it's from our brain, it knows what we know. And if I heard the gentleman here with the gold-rimmed glasses say to me, I know so much about the driver of your taxi yesterday, I'm going, how did he know? And we try to make sense of our psychotic experiences. So there is the risk of dependence. Again, impaired attention, concentration, focus can cause risk on the roads as well. And what we'll do with the next few minutes is to cover some areas of managing problematic cannabis use, and we'll elaborate on these with exercise in the afternoon. So the adverse effects, drowsiness, dizziness, dry mouth, nausea, and some young people refer to it as greening out, as the vomiting. And greening out, that's cannabis-induced hyperemesis, is a real phenomenon. Being high, euphoria, headache in some people, blood pressure dropping, and cannabis does have cardiac effects. Tachycardia for some people as well. And yet, this is not just something you can easily guess, because for some people it's a straight green. You use the cannabis, they feel okay, and so on. Another person uses, and it gets into a zone of having adverse effects. Another person uses, they've got some adverse effects, and then it gets really, really distressing and difficult for them. And for some people, it's just a straight red. They use a bit of a cannabis product, and they're really, really impaired. Some of these slides are probably made available, so because it's going to be difficult to go through all the contents directly. Now, we hear about people say, oh, cannabis is good, we can use for veterans and PTSD and so on. But there is a dose-response curve. So in low doses, some amount of THC can reduce anxiety. You increase it a bit more, rather than reduce anxiety, it increases anxiety. Increase it more, I start getting paranoid. Give it the full whack, I could become psychotic. So what potency? Are we talking 2% THC or 28% THC? We cannot generalize. And that's why when people say it works for something, what potency with whose endocannabinoid system, under what conditions? So really, one of the strategies is starting low. Start low, go slow. If it's edibles and so on, start around 2.5 milligrams or less and go slow. Knowing full well, if you stop suddenly, some people will have a cannabis withdrawal syndrome, and a cannabis withdrawal syndrome would have features like nightmares, being anxious, irritable, and so on. And there'll be young people who would swear, I was well till I went to hospital. It was when I got into hospital I started having nightmares. I became irritable, grumpy, and so on. And they may actually be going through a cannabis withdrawal syndrome. Or they ended up being on remand or with the police or somewhere, and then they become way more disturbed. It may actually be a withdrawal syndrome. So really the goal then is to cut down the THC content and to increase the CBD content should the person still need to use. We can assess this with tools like the CUDIS, the Cannabis Use Disorder Identification Test. You'll have copies of this available to you. It's the contemplation ladder converts into a circle, and this was a bit of my geekiness. But the features of this are really red being pre-contemplative, orange being contemplative, and then the process of change. Recognizing this can be circular. Also, I may determine, hey, you know, John, I will never ever smoke weed again. I'm never going to smoke weed again, but John, I love my edibles. And we may be pre-contemplative and contemplative with different cannabis products in different ways. Finally, in the last few minutes I have, courtesy of Cyril, the last bit is really going to show why what we think we know as knowledge, really as youth workers and as professionals or whatever we do, is always going to be tested. So knowledge pull is when we search for knowledge. You Google something, that's knowledge pull. Knowledge push is what I'm trying to do here. But knowledge pull is also very powerful. And in youth work, we've got to recognize that these factors come to play all the time. So, you know, scientific research, educational, pamphlets, leaflets, all the research. Some of the knowledge we know comes from rats. Does that apply to humans? Well, some humans are called rats, but it's different to this. And really, with courses going on and all the education, whose knowledge is it and where do we sit with the knowledge? If a guy's smoked cannabis for 40 years and an academic says, I do research into cannabis, who knows more? And whose knowledge is it? Now, the number of publications to do with cannabis have gone up exponentially since 1989. So does that mean we know a lot more? Well, the most published person in cannabis, and for those of you here who are academics, 3,651 citations is huge. If I published something that had that number of citations, I'll just stand in front of you and just smile. That's me done. So these are huge numbers, but are these numbers really huge? In science, they are, but let's match them against the real big boys in the knowledge space. There are magazines being published, and you can pick up these and read all the fancy knowledge published there. But again, how does this match against other settings? Now let's get into the world of influencers. Snoop Dogg and Wiz Khalifa, YouTube, 500 million hits for the song Young, Wild and Free. 500 million. Afro Man, because I Go High, millions. Wheeler Walker, Lil Dicky. Even the comments are more than anyone's publications. So these are huge, and these numbers go up in the millions weekly. Logic, another musician who sings about mental health issues and so on, demonstrates that actually you can use these sort of media also to present mental health images. And you may know the 1-800 song. If not, we'll play it in the interlude. And knowledge pull, again, people searching for cannabis and so on. So cannabis searches, the peak there is with legalization in Canada. But check out the word cannabinoids, what you clever, knowledgeable people talk about. Flat line. No one's searching for cannabinoids. They're searching for marijuana, weed, cannabis. Vaping, that's got a spike. And if you look at the searches done around this period, does vaping kill? Will I die? And so on. And people are really interested about CBD more than THC and so on. So there are different trends in the way people search. CBD more than THC. And that knowledge space is very dynamic. But the evidence, as we know it, is that there's a lot we don't know yet. And this has a challenge because you have different professional bodies publishing these, and they're very useful. They give us guidance and guidelines. Systematic review of systematic reviews of cannabinoids, mother of all studies, and so on. And these are out over and over, but they don't give us all the answers. There's still a lot we need to know. So really, can we measure smoke? I'm going to see if I can do 60 seconds, 120 seconds, says Cyril, of wrapping up. What is a joint? Which of these is a joint? After all, the person says he smokes 4 joints a day. Which size? Smoking topography. People smoke in different ways. Some people have a mouth hold. And some, it's different. You're dosing very differently. Also, if you look at the products available, pre-rolled joints from the the Ontario Cannabis Store, milligram for milligram, the lowest to the highest potency dose are 65-fold difference. So I could be smoking one joint pre-rolled that's 65 times more potent than another. You've got Ontario Cannabis Store grading. Now in the UK, skunk and others referred to as high potency are within the 15% range. Cannabis research done in the US is only from one FDA-approved center, University of Mississippi, and you cannot use products beyond 15% THC. Many people turn back the weed if their weed man gives them 15%. So are we comparing like with like? No. Bong bowls are different in size. 11, 14, 18 millimeter. The joints, is it a pinner? Is it a blunt, which is like a cigar? They are very different. And this measuring is a challenge. So when we are talking about, it's really, really tricky. The last few slides pretty much just showing attempts researchers and social scientists have done to try and measure. Some people decide, okay, we're going to measure sewage. After all, a lot of cannabis metabolites end up in wee and poo. In fact, 60% ends up in poo. And what they found was, this is for, I think this is Ontario also, but looking at the trends, that if they look in sewage and test the THC metabolites, they had a peak. Now, the researchers actually felt there was a bit of an aberration, but there's a peak there. Do you know what it is about that peak? 420 effect. So people have had 420, it ends up in poo and wee, and then there's a peak in the sewage of cannabis metabolites. And that changes. Others have done research looking at garbology, looking at rubbish in the bins and so on, and looking at cannabis products there to just try and measure, because people do not report cannabis use very, very accurately. So it's a complex pharmacology. There are genetic differences. Whether or not we have tolerance is different. Potency is different. The ratios are different. Whether or not we have a medical disorder would influence it. It's difficult to get precise with doses. A plug for this resource, and for those of you who work with youth, drugcocktails.ca is quite a good resource. The top right corner has a hide this site button. And this is reinforced by pharmacists and specialists. And if you click that hide this site button, you just get a Google. So mum and dad walk in, click, and they don't know that this is what you're researching, drugs and cannabis. So really, in wrapping up, cannabis, there's no single cannabis. The effects are different. Edible, smoked, ingested are different. They're different cannabinoids, we have different endocannabinoid systems, and ratios are different. And ultimately, as we start moving away from the kaleidoscope of cannabis, stay tuned, because the next offering may actually be the chameleon of cannabis. Thank you very much.